Hello, this is a recording for part of the Pagan Federation's Virtual Moot series. The theme for the upcoming one is pride, as in sort of, well, what used to be gay pride, but now is inclusive LGBTQ and the rest of it pride. Chance for pagans who are gay or bisexual or transgender or whatever else to celebrate their identity and I suppose put issues of interest or concern or what have you out to reflect upon by the people watching these videos. So my contribution towards this Pride Festival is going to be to reflect upon a Chinese deity, Tu Er Shen, which is a little odd because, as you will notice, I am not in the least bit Chinese. I don't have any Chinese ancestry at all. And it's difficult to explain why Tu Er Shen speaks to me. He's a deity I encountered quite a few years ago now, and something sparked, something inspired. Very generally, I can't claim to have had any sort of road to Damascus experiences of hearing the voice of Tu Er Shen booming out at me from burning shrubbery or anything quite like that. That's a lot of conflated stories there in one, isn't it? Never mind. But there's been a growing interest in Tu Er Shen since I first encountered details about him. I've told stories, some of which are recorded on my blog, written poems, and I will be inflicting one of them on you momentarily. So I'm going to look at the themes of why Tu Er Shen interests me, issues in his worship and reverence, and how that impacts on it maybe a more philosophical level in other regards. So a little bit of historical background to Tu Er Shen. He's part of the Taoist tradition, or Shen Taoism, which is this rural version of Taoism, the old early gods, the polytheist version. You can be a non-theist Taoist. You can practice Taoism as an atheist, but the older tradition, the Shen Taoism, is very centered on a multitude of gods and goddesses, and he's part of that tradition. It's a common feature of the majority of Taoism, Shintoism, that the gods are seen as beings who were once human in some capacity, and usually at death they undergo a sort of transcendence as they shift up to the higher realms, and they become these demigods sometimes to start with, and then eventually full-blown immortals with a vast range of powers, and people pray to them and so forth. And it's such a common practice that when religious movements from other parts of the world have arrived in China, often they've been given backstories to make them fit into that kind of Chinese cultural pattern. Stories which they didn't have on their very first arrival in China when they were brought over by immigrants or by missionaries or whoever it is that brought that deity. So, for example, Kuan Yin, when she first arrives in China, well, to start with, she arrived as a man and then became Kuan Yin, the goddess, which is a whole story in itself. And she acquired a backstory about how she had become the goddess of mercy, which wasn't part of her earlier devotions when she was an Indian deity. Well, Indian Buddha, at any rate. That's a whole. Sorry, not Buddha. Buddha's out, but that's a whole other thing in itself. Anyway, back to Tu Er Shen. The name translates into English as either the rabbit god or the leveret god. Leveret, if you're unfamiliar with the term, being a baby hare. Quite common in a lot of cultures for the word for rabbit and the word for hare to be one and the same thing. So he's a deity associated either with hares or with rabbits, depending on how you want to interpret that word, or both, probably. His human backstory is that he was once a warrior, once a soldier called Hu Chanbao. And he'd been serving in Fujian province in China. And one day an imperial inspector arrives in that part of China, in the Fujian province, to inspect. And he's a very handsome man, a very desirable, very charismatic man. Also a bit of a git, frankly, in the story. He's not a very nice man, but a very good-looking man. Hu Chanbao falls in love with him, But we have a problem, and it's not maybe the problem that some viewers might assume it to be. The problem is not that this is two men in love. The problem is that this is a lower class man, soldier, falling in love with an upper class man, an imperial inspector. And the divide that cannot be crossed is social class rather than the issue of them both being men. It's one thing if the inspector fancies picking up someone from the lower classes, that's kind of permissible as long as it doesn't lead to anything permanent. But it's certainly not appropriate for the person of the lower class to make the first move. It would be the same kind of shock value, I suppose, that Lady Chatterley's Lover had back in the day when it was published. This idea of the servant coming on to the lady of the manor was all very shocking back then. And likewise, when this story was first being circulated a few chapters, it would have been shocking for the soldier to be making overtures to the imperial inspector. But the man is in love. His heart's been taken by this rather haughty inspector, and he does something a little bit naughty, perhaps by modern standards, but we all do mad things when we're in love. The inspector is in the bathhouse scrubbing his nether regions, and if you imagine the style of bathhouse in that day, the soldier goes and drills a little hole in the wall so he can peek through and spy on the handsome inspector having a bath, and see him in the altogether, as it were. He obviously does something to attract attention, makes a noise, we can imagine what, and the inspector looks around and realises there's a spy hole in the wall and he's being gawped at, so he sends for his guards who rush around and find this soldier kneeling down, peeking through the hole in the wall, and drag him before the imperial inspector, who one assumes by this point has toweled off a bit and put his clothes back on. And the inspector is so horrified that this mere peasant, this commoner, has been ogling him in the bath, that he orders his bodyguards to kick 7 shades out of Hu Chambao, and they give him such a kicking that the poor man dies and goes up to, well, not so much up as down to the gates of hell, and there he faces the god of the dead. And as is standard practice, the god of the dead says, well, what happened to you then? How did you die? And the spirit, the soul of Hu Chambao explains that he was peeking through the bathroom wall at the handsome inspector, and along came the guards and kicked 7 shades out of him and stamped on his head until he died. And the god of the dead says, well, this presents a dilemma, because you have died for love. You were in love and your love was rejected, and because of that rejection you are now dead. Therefore you do not deserve to come into the realms of hell, the realms of torment. You should be up there in the heavens, not down here in hell. You don't deserve to be suffering, you deserve to be rewarded. So he sends the spirit of Hu Chambao up to the heavens, and there he meets with the august Jade Emperor and various other deities, and they again say, well, how did you die? And he repeats the story. And they decide that, yes, anyone who dies for love deserves to be in the heavenly realms, not in the hellish realms. And so he becomes a demigod, and he takes on a new name. He becomes Tu Er Shen, the rabbit god. The term rabbit, the Chinese term for rabbit, is, or was, probably still is, a euphemism for gay men. It's not clear from the sources I've looked into whether it was a term to describe gay men only because of the story of Tu Er Shen, or whether it predates that story and maybe the kind of interweaving of rabbits into the story, because as you'll note from that story, there's no rabbit in the actual story of how Hu Chambao dies or any of that. So is his association with rabbits because that word was already in usage as a euphemism long before the story is told, or as a subsequence? One argument is that a lunar month after Hu Chambao dies, his spirit, which has now become the demigod Tu Er Shen, starts manifesting in dreams to people in Fujian province, and one old man goes and talks about the dreams he's had of the magical rabbit appearing to him and saying who he is, and he's this new god and he wants a temple. And sufficient number of people believe the old man, and the various other people go, oh, I also had a dream just like that, that they then go and build temples in Fujian province, and it becomes a practice, it becomes a thing. As a historical phenomenon, this is relatively late. The story is recorded in a book called, any Chinese speakers listening to this, I shall have to ask your forgiveness for my abysmal Chinese pronunciation, but Zibuyu, which in English is what the master would not discuss, the master in this case being Confucius. The author of the book was an elderly man called Yuan Mai, and he published it in 1788. So he was publishing this as a story which was doing the rounds in Fujian relatively recently to his writing it down in 1788. So this is not an old religious cult going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, a relatively recent manifestation. But it caught on. There were quite a number of temples built, and there are various descriptions given of these temples as to what they were like, including one by a rather charmless government bureaucrat called Chu Gui, who says how immoral and awful these temples are, and that they have statues in them of two men sometimes holding hands and sometimes kissing. And there's an older man and a younger man, a sort of mature man and a youthful man. And it's immoral and wicked, and people make offerings when men want to, you know, either they're lonely and they want a nice man to accompany them, or they've fallen in love with somebody, a bit like Hu Jianbao, and they want their love reciprocated. They go and make offerings in these temples, and if their prayers are answered, then they give offerings of pork and offerings of sugar to the statues. Chu Gui says this is, you know, typical of the degeneracy of the age, and isn't it awful and terrible? So he was sort of like a Daily Mail journalist in 18th century China, in a sense, essentially. And he was partly responsible for closing down a lot of those temples, not exclusively because they were places of devotion for men. I'm hesitating to use the word gay because that is a very modern concept. People in other cultures have other words and other terms, and it's not always right to be imposing very modern, very Western ideas on other parts of the world in other periods of history. But men who fancied each other would go on to these temples. It wasn't just that. Part of the arguable problem is that there was a degree of sedition associated with a number of the, not just this cult, because he was moaning about several other religious cults at the same time, and that they were often seen as very critical of the Qing dynasty, of which he was an administrator, and had very unflattering things to say about the Qing royal family. Therefore, this was maybe more politics than it was what we in this day and age would call gay bashing. Wasn't anything in that sense. So we shouldn't rush to see homophobia everywhere when maybe there are other explanations going on. Therein lies a whole other story in itself, I think. Not perhaps a desperately popular one. One of the interesting things I want to reflect on, interesting for me if not for you, is that what Chu Gui describes in the temple, the statue of the older man, the statue of the younger man, as a partnership, is very reflective, not so much of the actual story in the myth, where you've got an adult soldier and the adult inspector, they're two maybe men of very similar age, but the sort of older-younger dynamic going on is reflective of a number of other cultures. So in books of the age, there's mention of a common format of relationship, particularly in the Fujian province, where Hu Jianbao, if he ever did live as a flesh and blood human being, that is, of course, where he existed, of the Qizhong, the older man, and the Qidi, the younger man. coming together. So the older one with more money, more social status, takes on well, presumably good-looking young man. And the chidi is the sort of the male bride in the relationship. And there's an assumption that the older man will be the more dominant one in the relationship, and the younger man maybe either doesn't have a job, or at least has a rather low-paying job, and the older man has more money, more status, more social accomplishment, and so on. So it's a power dynamic going on there, and it's very reminiscent of the ancient Greek concept of the Orestes, the older man, and the Eromenus, the younger man. Although we also have the same suggestion if you look at the poetry written by Sappho of Lesbos, who, contrary to popular rumour, liked both women and men. She wrote love poetry to men and love poetry to women, but usually to younger women. And she herself being an older, mature woman at the time. So again, it's the older, richer one being interested in the younger, more glamorous ones. The Spartans had the similar concept of the Aispnalus, the established warrior, the older, richer man, and the Aetes, the speaker and the listener, is what those terms translate as. The one who gives wisdom and the one who listens to wisdom. But there's not only a sort of a social relationship of the older one introducing the younger one to society to make good business contacts, good contacts in general in society, helping them to polish their table manners so they don't make social gaffes when they're out in public, kind of inducting them into wider society. And there is also this sexual element to the relationship as well. And it's one that has assumptions about the kinds of sexual activity of who will do what to who, which, without needing to get too detailed, I'm sure you can guess the implications behind that. It's all fairly obvious. But this is a pattern that repeats in a number of different cultures, which I find quite interesting. The persistence of that idea, and you could argue it kind of goes all the way down into Western culture. A lot of the rather faux outrage at Oscar Wilde during his trial was that he was the older, flamboyant, very educated, very upper class, very well-to-do, wealthy, theatrical impresario who had a taste for rough lads from the East End, and eventually, of course, for the dreadful Alfred Douglas, who, whilst he was very posh, was nonetheless the younger one, who was, if you like, being kind of given the cultural polish and savoir-faire by Oscar Wilde. And again, it's this, the direct complaint, if you look at the trial record, was the judge and the prosecutor saying, you should have known better, you were rich, you were powerful, you were high status, you were very well educated, you knew better than to corrupt these gullible young men. And there's always this assumed dynamic that the young men are gullible, being led astray, and the older one is the one doing the corrupting, rather than assuming that maybe the young men are quite happy with this relationship, that they admire the famous, exciting, ever so clever older Oscar Wilde or whatever. That this is a meeting of free wills rather than some dirty old man corrupting something slightly gormless lads from the East End or what have you. It's the assumption made by the authorities as to what they wanted to read into that relationship, and I would argue a lot of those assumptions persisted all the way up to the point where in this country we had the arguments over the age of equalising the age of consent between straight people and gay people. And a lot of the voices in resistance to that, saying, oh no, we shouldn't do it, it's wrong, were often citing this very idea that if you had, say, 16, 17, 18-year-old lads being gay or bisexual, that they'd only do so if some dirty old man had led them astray or corrupted them or bribed them or whatever. Which isn't to say that never goes on, because obviously it does. know of one or two cases over time, but it's also an assumption that it's always going to be exploitation, rather than considering that it might be perfectly willing. Lots of 16, 17-year-olds, gay, straight, whatever they are eager to get into relationships, whether it's with somebody who's older or the similar age to themselves or what have you. So that rather Victorian frame of mind that condemned Oscar Wilde wasn't purely the product of the Victorian age. It's something that echoes back across a number of cultures, across the centuries, across the millennia, to an assumption of what a sexual, social relationship should be in the first place. Whereas the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the Chinese were seeing that as a positive thing. Wouldn't it be good to marry your daughter off to a somewhat older man who was financially stable, who'd take care of her and look after her, and make sure she was always well provided for? And in places like Fujian, they were saying exactly the same thing in terms of, would it be good to marry your son off to an older man who was also financially stable and would look after your offspring and all the rest of it? What was considered a normal relationship at that point in time by the Victorian age had come to be seen as a corrupting relationship rather than as a supportive relationship. So it's a sort of, the ideas go back to the ancient one, but they become seen in a darker and darker, more and more gruesome light as the centuries roll past, and arguably as, of course, religion changes and the moral values change within the different religions that come into play. So some generic ideas there. I'll read the poem in a moment, and then afterwards we'll have a brief discussion. I'll try and make it brief. About the idea underpinning Tu Er Shen having been a human being, having been Hu Bao before becoming the rabbit god, and how that relates to ideas in Romano-Greek and Egyptian religion. But so the poem is called Little Rabbit. The metrical style is one I just made up on the spur of the moment. Or I could pretend I was inspired, couldn't I? That sounds a bit more upmarket. I was inspired. I didn't make it up, I was inspired. Having told you the story of the little rabbit god, the rabbit god, then this poem will make a little bit more sense, hopefully. Little rabbit lies bleeding, his beloved unheeding of the scarlet on the tiles. Little rabbit lies weeping, his brief memories seeping, whilst his harsh assassin smiles. Little rabbit loves him still, this lord who caused such ill, has worshipped him from afar. Little rabbit gazed, yearning, unrequited love burning, leaves its own soul-searing scar. Little rabbit kneels spying, beneath his lord's veil prying, humble soldier needs to know. Little rabbit blind to pride, high lord wanted no man bride, raging, scorning, lays him low. Little rabbit, eyes dimming, faces in the pall brimming, distorted souls reflect true. Little rabbit slips the coil, leaves behind such fruitless toil, from bloody bathhouse soul flew. Little rabbit sits dreaming, whilst turns a full moon's gleaming before King Yan's divine throne. Little rabbit heaven sent, ensures now no love unspent, that no man should die unknown. Little rabbit Tu Er Shen grants the love of men to men, brother bucks beneath the pelt. Little rabbit made divine, fleshed by such love, yours and mine, in each caress he is felt. Although you've got Chu Gui doing his best to stamp out these cults to the little rabbit god, these temples of the little rabbit god back in the 1760s, and for a period succeeding, a lot of buildings were torn down and destroyed, and the statues burned, and books thrown on funeral pyres and so forth. Nonetheless, there was a revival, a modern late 20th, early 21st century revival in places like Taiwan, where you've got a huge Chinese expat community who fled communism when Mao Zedong was slaughtering Buddhist monks and Taoist priests and Christian missionaries and so on, in his sort of born-again atheist zeal to kill off anyone associated with what he perceived as superstition. An awful lot of people who didn't want to live under the Maoist yoke went to places like Taiwan and stayed there, still hoping to keep free of the still very intolerant brand of communism that is present in China. And there is a chap in Taiwan who has set up a temple to Tu Er Shen, which gets an awful lot of visitors, mostly gay and bisexual men wanting either to find love, or if they've already found it, to have their union blessed by the power of Tu Er Shen to grant them, you know, happiness and good fortune and what have you in life, which I think is a rather lovely idea. And if I had enough money to go jetting around the world, Taiwan is a place I'd be interested to visit. There's a lot of fascinating religious history and practice in Taiwan itself, of which that temple is but one example of a whole raft of really quite intriguing cultural practices over there. But getting back to the philosophical point, the other thing I wanted to reflect on, in the story of Hu Qianbao becoming Tu Er Shen, we have this standard Taoist notion of the sort of translation of the mortal soul into a divine immortal status, to become one of the divine beings of the universe. Back in the lifetime of the Emperor Hadrian, he fell madly in love. He was already married, he had children, he'd done all the things that were expected of him, but he fell madly in love with a young Greek, possibly Macedonian, he may have been either Greek or Macedonian, called Antinous. When I say fell madly in love, it's almost to a slightly obsessive degree. You could kind of think of it as a bit of one of those midlife crises that when he fell big time. Antinous and he were together for several years, and there was a lot of resentment amongst the advisors in court, the various political families, that this young lad had way too much influence over the emperor. The emperor was turning to him for advice on all sorts of things that some 18, 19-year-old really probably shouldn't have been advising the emperor of Rome upon. But such is the way of things. As I say, when he fell. And in due course, when he was roughly about 19, 20 years old, Antinous also fell off a boat into the River Nile, and he drowned. Historians to this day don't really know if he fell, an accident, boat could have bumped into a crocodile or something and knocked him off the side, or whether somebody shoved him. Was this murder? Maybe a political assassination because of the amount of clout he had over the emperor. They just wanted to get rid of him. Was it suicide? Was he sick to death of the emperor and threw himself over the side? I mean, who knows? Whatever the force that pushed him into the Nile, once he'd drowned, the emperor was heartbroken, absolutely gutted. It's kind of slightly reminiscent of Queen Victoria going into chronic mourning at the death of Albert. It was really that sort of level of grief. And it came very rapidly to Hadrian's attention that in Egyptian belief, in the religion of Kemet, because Azur, or Osiris as the Greeks called him, died in the Nile when his sarcophagus, he was sealed inside a sarcophagus and it was thrown into the Nile. Thereafter, anyone who drowned in the Nile got a sort of instant pass to the afterlife to become one of the Ahu, one of the shining ones, and become this great revered figure. If you're going to die, that was the way to die, in the Nile. And so rumour began to spread. People began to say they were having visions of Antinous, just as people started to say they were having dreams and visions of Tu Er Shen. There's no suggestion that Hadrian himself had one of these visions, only that he had heard reports coming into the court from this person, that person, some other person, that they had visions, and he was so moved, so enraptured by this idea that Antinous was not just dead, gone, but had become this rather divine, godlike figure, that he took it to heart, he believed it, and he spent several arms and legs on having temples to Antinous built in all sorts of parts of the empire. Priesthoods centred around Antinous, and again, rather like the shrines, the holy places of Tu Er Shen. These were, I mean, people came, you pray to a god for all sorts of things. It wasn't only men seeking relationships with other men that went to these temples. People came there for aches and pains and illnesses, and straight people wanting luck in love and marriage as well. It was quite a wide appeal, but clearly there were a lot of individuals going there because they wanted the same kind of love that the Emperor Hadrian had found with Antinous. They wanted to lose their hearts to some nice chap. That lasted for quite a long time, quite a few centuries, before the cult of Antinous eventually dwindled away into nothingness. At least it kind of did. Because there was a fad for collecting statuary associated with Antinous, busts and statues and what have you, wall friezes, which began to revive in the Renaissance period, with all of the interest in things classical in the Renaissance period. One of the biggest collections of statues of Antinous was owned by a Roman Catholic cardinal. Read into that what you like. It was a very done thing. Stately homes all over Europe would have ancient statues of Antinous on display in the house or in the garden or wherever they decided to put them. And so he enjoyed a bit of a revival. Now, I'm not suggesting that people like this cardinal with all the statues around were praying in front of them and lighting candles to Antinous necessarily. You never quite know, but I'm not outright suggesting that this was a cultic revival, but rather that the spirit of Antinous, in a sort of way that Jung talks about the spirit of Woden, the spirit of the essence of a deity, moving through the consciousness of a people, not necessarily motivating them to light candles and incense and dance around temples, but moving through the psyche, that even while the temples were in rack and ruin, no one necessarily was lighting incense or saying prayers, but nonetheless the spirit of Antinous became revived during the Renaissance and started to move through the people in Europe. Maybe at the same time the spirit of Tu Er Shen, well, slightly earlier, give or take a century, the spirit of Tu Er Shen was moving through people in China. Comparable influences, similar types of spirit perhaps in some respects. Not saying that they're one and the same thing, but there are definitely similarities and echoes between Tu Er Shen and Antinous. There are temples to Antinous, both virtual ones online, but also real-world temples to Antinous in the 21st century, as there are to Tu Er Shen in the 21st century. So these are movements that are there, and one wonders, is part of the factor that has led to social revolutions in countries that were previously locking up men for getting caught with each other, or executing them, or forcing them to have various gruesome medical treatments that were borderline torture. To move from that very rapidly in the space of a couple of decades after a lot of campaign, but once it happened by political standards very quickly, to move to periods of tolerance, periods of openness, periods of acceptance, in which, yes, people do get attacked. Today there's been an announcement on the news of a lesbian couple who were assaulted, blood all over the place, by a gang of what apparently were teenage lads on a bus. So there's still hostility, there's still violence, there's still threat. But let's say 2019 compared to 1919, much less 1818, 1819, you've got a huge rapid move towards fairly widespread tolerance, legally, socially, in all sorts of ways. And I wonder, maybe that's a bit romantic nonsense, but I wonder if to some extent that is the sort of spirit of these entities moving through the collective conscious of humanity, and finding hearers, finding listeners, not just in sense of people who want to run out and find a same-sex partner and live with them and what have you, but also, I can't stand that word allies, it's so tediously political, but straight people who think, great, fine, I've got a gay neighbour, I've got a gay person I work with, I like that gay actor on the telly or whatever, who have no issue with having gay friends, relatives, acquaintances, public figures. They too are maybe touched by this spirit moving through and spreading a sense of tolerance and understanding and openness in many ways. Though I say the world isn't perfect. That lesbian couple case in point and what happened to them. But things are vastly improved for most of us in the West. Some parts are clearly very not improved, where public executions and imprisonment and torture and so forth still take place. But times they are changing, at risk of sounding like Bob Dylan, God help us. I personally, last point to mention, I still personally struggle with this idea of a deity that was once human. Whether that's Hu Bao or Antinous, the idea of worshipping someone who either definitely was flesh and blood at one point, or who possibly maybe have been flesh and blood at one point, because obviously with Hu Bao it's a little bit more woolly as to how historically real he was. Or maybe this is just an apocryphal tale told to flash out the existence of the rabbit god. Who knows? There's a large part of me that's very uncomfortable with this worshipping of ex-humans. Partly because one can look around the world and see far too many religious movements based on the worship of ex-humans that have gone more than a little bit pear-shaped at some point in the time. And you can still see people who are alive at the moment who would like to be worshipped. Some of them succeed in getting worshipped, others just want it but don't get it. But they're very rarely nice or pleasant people, those who wish to be worshipped. So it's very chary with me. I can understand the Roman concept of the genius or the uno, the soul that everyone has, and if you could pray to anyone's soul to try and kind of feed their soul to make it get brighter and stronger. And if their soul gets stronger, the wisdom of the soul permeates the ego, the consciousness. And so when the Romans were praying to the soul of the emperor, what they really wanted was for his soul to get bright enough to make the mortal mind of the emperor wise and wonderful. Clearly didn't work very often. That's something I can kind of understand where they're coming from there. But it's still something I am reticent to. I did once try to make an altarpiece to Tu Er Shen out of clay, but frankly my artistic skills were a letdown that day, and what I produced was a mess. And so I've yet to revisit the project of trying to make a statue that actually looks good and doesn't fall apart after 2 days, which was part of the problem. So I can create a shrine to Tu Er Shen. I've looked online and never yet found a decent statue in a shop anywhere that I could order it, so hence trying to make my own. I've not been drawn to try and create a shrine to Antinous, although I do have a photograph of one of his statues hanging on the wall in the other room. I suppose the spark's got to be there or not. It's that awkwardness that this was once a person, which I can't quite get my head past. Maybe at some point in the future I will do so, but at the moment it's a hesitation. But anyway, these are examples of men who have fallen in love with other men, who have become figures of reverence and worship rather than figures of scorn and ridicule, who still persist in the ancient world despite falling out of favour either with the Chinese government or with just general European kings and queens and rulers and what have you. They have persisted. They have revived, maybe in a very small way, maybe in growing ways. And whatever the theology of worshipping the ex-human, it's good that people who have been condemned for such a long period of time still are condemned in places like Chechnya, places like Russia and so on, and quite a few of the African states. that we can also be positive figures, sacred figures, figures of admiration, figures whose benevolence and kindness can be turned to, rather than just being seen as either comic relief or as per Oscar Wilde, dirty old men or gullible young idiots being led astray. I think I'll finish there because my brain is going round in knots. But hopefully it will make some degree of sense. And if anyone does come across any nice statues of Tu Er Shen, please let me know. And if I never succeed in making one, perhaps I can at least acquire one, buy one, which might become a focal point for an altarpiece. Thank you.